Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm Tom Booker, I'm the senior instructor. This is our Warrior Personal Strength lesson, and we've been discussing applying self-control as our personal strength. And today, we're going to talk about the story of Ike and George and the tank, and about using self-control when we have something to be legitimately upset about. Now, after he graduated from West Point, one of Ike's first assignments was as an officer in the new Tank Corps. He was stationed at Camp Meade in Maryland. Now, in 1919, the tank itself was a new weapon. Ike had never even seen one before. He didn't know anything about how a tank worked or how it was supposed to be used. Fortunately, he had met a new friend, George PATTON, who did have some experience with tanks. George had worked with them in France during the last months of the First World War. He had learned a little bit and was eager to learn more. Ike and George decided they would have to teach themselves. They started off by taking a tank completely apart, and then they put it back together again so they would know how it worked. Then they started to test it out. They ran it across country to see how fast it would go. 5 miles an hour was its top speed. That's a brisk walking pace. They had it climb steep hills and cross deep ditches and wide streams to see what kind of obstacles it could drive over. It got stuck a lot. They fixed it when it broke down. It broke down a lot. Even so, Ike and George were excited. They believed the tank had a lot of potential. They talked together about how it could be improved and how it could be used. They were convinced tanks would be important in the future. They talked to anyone who would listen to them about how important tanks would become for the Army. They even wrote articles about tanks for the infantry journal. A few weeks later, the Chief of Infantry, General Charles Farnsworth, called Ike into his office. He had read Ike's article about tanks, and he wasn't pleased with Ike at all. He told Ike his ideas about tanks were all wrong, and not just wrong, but dangerous for the United States Army and for Ike himself. If he kept on talking and writing about how great tanks were going to be, he would get into serious trouble. He would face a court-martial for insubordination that would end his Army career. Now, George was talked to separately, but the message was just the same. Shut up about tanks or else. George was furious, and he didn't bother hiding it. He declared he would go back to the cavalry, where he and his ideas were properly appreciated. The infantry could keep its tanks. He would go back to riding horses. Now, Ike was every bit as angry, maybe even more so. Remember, Ike was the guy who went out into his backyard and started punching an apple tree when his parents told him he couldn't go out with his brothers on Halloween. And Ike was just as certain that he was right about tanks. he had kept his temper and had told General Farnsworth politely that yes, he would follow his orders. He didn't give up his conviction that the tank had potential that needed to be developed, but he knew that this would take many years. Right then, in 1920, tanks were slow and they were unreliable. They were more experimental than practical. Now, we've got a few questions about this story that I'd like you to think over, talk over at home with your parents. The first, Ike and George had spent many months of time and effort learning about tanks. Did they have a reason to be angry when General Farnsworth told them that they were wrong? The next question, do you think General Farnsworth believed that Ike and George were behaving irresponsibly about tanks? Next question, Ike knew from experience that tanks were slow, clumsy, and they broke down a lot. They would take many years of work to develop their potential. Do you think knowing this helped him to control his anger? All right, last question. Who do you think had the stronger self-control? George or Ike? Again, I'd like you to talk about these together at home. Think them over. And one of the things you can do for your first achievement stripe, if you can answer one of these questions, please send me the answer. You can send a video of yourself answering the question, or you can send your answer to me by email. Thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to talking more about this personal strength together next time.